Started. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to talk to you today about Canada and you discovering the Great White North. My name is Nick Allen, the U.S. Navy Liaison Officer to the Royal Canadian Navy. So a couple disclaimers before we get started. First, this presentation is for entertainment and mild educational purposes only. Anything expressed during this presentation does not reflect the opinions or official stance of the United States Navy, Department of Defense, United States government, etc. Further disclaimers: I have not studied Canada in any official means. Some information has been researched, however, some observations are purely anecdotal. And finally, I am not trained in foreign policy or foreign relations. So just an overview about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to do an introduction to Canada, Canadian geography, where we'll cover the provinces and territories, Canadian history, the Canadian government, their economy, their culture, and finally, my observations. So just want to provide you a little background on myself before we dive into the presentation. Like I said, I'm the U.S. Navy's liaison officer to the Royal Canadian Submarine Force. Prior to taking the job, I'd never been to Canada. I had never even thought about going to Canada, to be perfectly honest. I didn't know anything about the country before I came up here. So ultimately, this PowerPoint is basically a beginner's guide and just kind of the basic information I wish I'd known before I came up here. I've lived in Victoria, British Columbia for about 6 to 7 months now. And I guess just another disclaimer, I have not been outside British Columbia, but I've interacted with people from all across the country through the Navy. So I've gotten to know a little bit about Canadian culture across the nation that way. And then finally, I am the only American I know up here. I've been living on the Canadian economy. I've not met any other Americans since I've been up here. So just some quick facts about Canada. It was founded on the 1st of July, 1867, but it wasn't, oh, sorry, before we get into it, if you have any questions at any time, please interrupt, please stop me and I'll be happy to answer them. So sorry, back to the presentation. As far as I'm concerned, Canada wasn't given full independence until 1982, when the UK no longer had the right to amend the Canadian Constitution. Canada's population
I have a question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Can the Queen suspend the government still? Because that's something that I lived in Australia for a while, and I knew that was something that could happen there.
Yes.
What power does the Queen have?
I'm going to ask that I will address that question in my favorite moment in Canadian history when we get to.
Damn, sorry to ruin something.
No, you're fine. I'll preface it. It's my favorite Canadian history moment. It occurred in the 1920s, but the short answer is yes, the Queen can suspend the Canadian government.
Cool.
She does have that privilege. Thank you for the question. So yeah, the Canadian population, 37.59 million. And just for example, California is 39.51 million, just to get an idea of the different size of the population. They don't have any pennies. They did away with them in the late 2000s, early 2010s. They're the second largest country in the world by landmass, and it is true that 90% of the population lives within 100 miles of the US border. Canadians can go to Cuba. There's no trade embargo like we have in the States. So we do have Cuban rum, Cuban cigars, other things like that up in Canada. And the first patent for peanut butter was actually passed in Quebec in the late 1800s, about 5 years before the Kellogg's provided their patent in the US. Again, I had nowhere else better to put this slide in the presentation, but just to show you the difference in population between the US and Canada. This isn't fact checked. I just saw it on Reddit and wanted to throw it in here. But this is the US population in units of Canada's. So again, like while it is a large physical country, there just aren't that many people in Canada. So I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with Canadian provinces and territories. I essentially was completely ignorant to it before I came up here. So just to go over them real quick, moving from west to east, you have British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec. The next three are referred to as the Maritimes. Think of it honestly kind of like New England. That's New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. You also have Newfoundland and Labrador, which is commonly just referred to as Newfoundland. And they're kind of the Maritimes, but for some stuff we'll get into later, I wouldn't lump them in that same category. In addition to that, you have three territories. You have the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and none of it. So I'd be asking, hey Nick, what's the difference between a province and a territory? It seems kind of arbitrary. So ultimately, it's where they derive their power. So provinces have their power given to them from the Canadian Constitution, which was passed in 1867, and it clearly defines the differences between provincial and federal Canadian government powers. Again, we'll address that in a little bit when we get to the government. But ultimately, provinces, one of the biggest differences is that provinces can amend their own constitutions. Territories, on the other hand, have all their power dictated to them by the federal government. They don't have the power to amend their own constitutions, and only the federal government of Canada has the ability to amend their constitutions. So next, I just want to kind of give you guys a snapshot of each province, just so you can kind of get an idea of what we're dealing with. So in the same order, first we have British Columbia. Honestly, think a lot of the US left coast. Think like Seattle, Washington, well, even parts of Oregon, including the rural areas. The major cities, you have Victoria, which is the capital where I live. That's a picture of it behind. Vancouver's the biggest city, and you also have Whistler, which is a ski resort town that some of you might have been to. It's very warm on the coasts. Like it typically never dips below 40 and never gets above probably mid 70s to low 80s. And then there are lots of killer whales, bears, and cougars within the province. They're actually like a legitimate thing you kind of need to be on the lookout for and worry about. Next, you have Alberta, which is the most conservative province in Canada and is referred to as Canada's Texas, unironically. The major cities in Alberta, you have Calgary and Edmonton, which is the capital. So picture behind us is a picture of Banff National Park. The Canadian Rockies come up through Alberta, and honestly, I had plans to go there this summer that COVID interrupted, but I've heard it's absolutely beautiful. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Alberta is where you have most of the Canadian oil sands, where they produce their natural gases, their crude oil to be exported. And ultimately, with Alberta, there are no provincial taxes. So they do still have federal tax, but there's no sales tax. There's no, provincial income tax, nothing like that. So that, I guess that kind of lends itself to the analogy of being Canada's Texas. Next, you have Saskatchewan. Think Great Plains. Major cities are Saskatoon and Regina, which are extremely small cities. In the US, we would count them just as kind of minor towns. They're known for their farms and mineral extraction. Next to Saskatchewan is Manitoba. Honestly, there is not much difference between Manitoba and Saskatchewan, except for the major city and capital of Winnipeg, which I've heard is a lot like Minneapolis, St. Paul, just as a comparison. Again, mineral extraction, farmland, and probably the only difference between that and Saskatchewan are there are more lakes in Manitoba like there are in Minnesota. Next, you have Ontario, which is kind of weird because it's both the largest population province, but it also has a lot of farmland. Major cities, you have Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, Toronto, which is the capital of Ontario. But then you also have Hamilton, London, Thunder Bay, some other major cities. Just to show you the difference between like Toronto and rural Ontario, Letterkenny, the TV show, if any of you guys have seen it, is set in rural Ontario. And when most of you guys think of the stereotypical Canadian accent, you're probably thinking of an Ontario accent. Next, you have Quebec, which I'm sure you guys know is the French province in Canada. Major cities, you have Quebec City, which is the capital, and Montreal. It's definitely one of the bigger banking provinces, a lot of heavy industry, and it's the most rebellious province, as we'll get into when we talk about the history of Canada. Next, you have New Brunswick, which is part of the Maritimes, and honestly, think Maine. It's located right above it. It has a couple small cities, and like Maine, it's known for fishing and lobsters. And Pat, this is a shout out to you. The longest covered bridge in the world is located in New Brunswick.
Holy shit, I'm going.
Yeah, go check that out. Next, you have Nova Scotia, which literally means New Scotland. Its major city is Halifax, which is a fairly substantial town. It's close to 1 million. It's definitely in the upper couple hundred of thousands. its fishing is honestly what it's known for the most. And it's the most maritime of the Maritimes simply because it's where the largest population is from. So most people think of it as kind of the center of the region. Next, you have Prince Edward Island, which is a tiny province. I think the entire population is less than 300,000. It is, I guess you'd call it the major city, which is its capital of Charlottetown. It is fishing, and honestly, it is so small, I genuinely couldn't find any fun facts even after talking to other Canadians. Newfoundland and Labrador is one of my favorite provinces. It's the most un-Canadian province. They are very proud of not joining the Confederation of Canada until 1949, after World War II. The major city is St. John's. Honestly, their accent is the most incredible thing I've ever heard. It sounds like they're more Irish than anything else. It's a very thick, brew almost. Like you almost can't understand them or think they'd be from North America. And honestly, they are the province that Canadians like to make fun of the most, just ahead of Quebec for their accents, their stubbornness, and they're one of the few provinces that has a population that still clubs seals. So they get a lot of crap for that from the rest of Canada. I'm gonna talk about the territories real quick, just so you know about them. I'm not gonna go too in depth just because there aren't too many people there. But you have the Yukon Territory, which you can just think of as Canadian Alaska. The Northwest Territory, which is not the most Northwest territory. And Nunavut, which is both a dry territory where a handle of vodka will sell for as much as $600. And it has a large population of First Nation and Inuit people. So now we're going to get into the history of Canada. And I apologize and trigger warning before I get into this. I mainly kept this from a Eurocentric view. So just be aware that there were First Nations people in Canada prior to its discovery, but I'm not going to be getting into that too much for time constraints. So Canada was first discovered by the Vikings in Newfoundland around 1000 AD. They did establish some permanent settlements, but ultimately they did die out and they weren't able to permanently keep population there. It was rediscovered in 1497 when John Cabot landed with his son while searching for the Northwest Passage. Pictured on the slide is him informing the First Nations people that Britain had arrived and that they were now under the domain of the UK. They wouldn't establish anything permanent the first time they came. Rather, they would exploit some of the area for their cod population. But actually, interestingly enough, it was the Portuguese and the Spanish that were the first ones to really take a claim and take an interest in Newfoundland. They didn't set up any permanent fortifications or anything that there's still much an archaeological remnants of, but they, for about 10 to 20 years, they would come back, fish the grounds, but they would ultimately leave Newfoundland to focus on their South American colonies. The next to arrive were the French, who realized they need to get serious about conquering the New World around 1534. Jacques Cartier was the first major explorer, and he actually is the one who coined the name Canada. Basically, he and his discovery party came across a tribe of First Nations people who invited them to come to their village of Kanata. The Catholic missionary who was acting as the translator for the mission mistranslated it and said that the First Nations were saying, oh, like this whole country is called Canada. And ultimately that is what stuck. And that's why we have Canada today. So the French actually decided to stick around and try to set up some permanent establishments. They claimed land around the St. Lawrence River, which encompasses modern day Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. By 1604, the French crown had officially granted a monopoly to the first French companies in order to get natural resources and beaver pelts from the New World and send it back to France. This also prompted them to explore farther along the St. Lawrence River and expand out in that direction. The oldest city in North America was founded in 1608 when Quebec City was founded by the French explorer Champlain, who the lake is named after. And he would travel west and deal with a lot of First Nations tribes, establishing relations with them. and he ultimately made it about as far west as the Detroit area. So the British realized that in addition to their colonies down south, they needed to have a presence in Canada as well. So in 1538, Humphrey Gilbert claimed St. John's, Newfoundland for the British. And by 1629, the settlement of Nova Scotia was established in order to have a claim over the fishing grounds in the area. But by 1631, it was an economic nightmare. And the British Crown willingly gave over Nova Scotia to the French. New France, or the Company of New France, administered over the colonies until 1663, when the French Crown basically saw it as a large enough economic interest where they took direct control over the colonies from the company. I guess one of the problems that New France was having in the New World was, as of 1666, only 3,200 people lived in the New World, and they were mostly frontiersmen, adventurers, things like that, so not great for establishing a permanent colony where you could continue to have generation after generation establishing a permanent presence. So ultimately, the British and the French being so close to each other in a lot of the same lands was going to lead to some conflict between the two. So one of the things that sparked it off was the British created the Hudson Bay Company, which still exists today as a kind of a Canadian equivalent of Macy's. And more French immigrants started to come over. Ultimately, the French led raids into land claimed by the Hudson Bay Company in 1686 and spurred the first of four French and Indian Wars and what we know as the 7 Years' War over a period of 1688 to 1763. So ultimately, France slowly lost ground between each of these wars. I'm not going to get into detail of each single one, but it ultimately resulted in France ceding all of New France in 1763 in the Treaty of Paris. You had both George Washington and General Cornwallis played roles in the 7 Years' War prior to the Revolution. So next comes the Revolution. When America kicked off, Canadians were largely actually apathetic to removing French rule from Canada. This is kind of nuanced, but there are a couple major reasons. So first was that the French in Quebec were satisfied with the British concessions to the French people and the Catholic faith. Ultimately, when in the Treaty of Paris, when New France was given to the British allowed the practicing Catholics in Quebec to continue practicing Catholicism. And in addition to that, shout out to Leo, the French use a civil code by what we use in the US and most of Canada, which is a common law code for our laws. So ultimately, the big difference is that in Britain, a lot of laws are based off of previous rulings, and they'll cite previous court cases when setting precedent, while the French Civil Code uses a very dictated and defined set of laws and standards, and the British let Quebec continue to practice that form of legalism. So the Quebecers weren't particularly interested in joining a rebellion when they already have what they wanted. There's also significant geography difference between the British Canadians and the colonies. If we go back to the previous slide, you can see the major British colonies of Newfoundland and Acadia, which we know today is New Brunswick and like Halifax, for example. There's a bit of difference from there between Boston, so they weren't able to mobilize and contribute. And ultimately, the Canadians were tired of war. They didn't want to participate in another battle, another fight against the British. Continental Congress did send multiple missions to Canada to try to garner support, but it was largely met with apathy. And there were two invasions that were done, the more famous one being done by Benedict Arnold early in the war, which ultimately failed at the walls of the city of Quebec. Ultimately, though, the outcome of the revolution was that when the U.S. did finally establish independence, a lot of loyalists ended up leaving and moving up to Nova Scotia. Kind of the first moment that defined Canada as a nation, as opposed to just a colony of the UK, was the War of 1812. It really brought the Canadian population out of apathy from just being subject to the British Empire and made them Canadians. There are a lot of causes that started the War of 1812, and I'm not going to get into all the complex intricacies. But ultimately, there were frontier clashes kind of out in the Ohio Valley between the U.S. and Canada. And one of the outcomes of the War of 1812 was that it definitively kind of established that border and established Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, that area as firmly U.S. territory as opposed to Canadian. Kind of an interesting figure to come out of the War of 1812 on the Canadian side is Laura Secord. She lived just west of Buffalo, kind of in the Niagara area, and her husband fought for the British. He would ultimately be wounded and their house would be occupied by American forces. One night she overheard US soldiers talking about a plan to take Beaver Dams, which ultimately would have secured US control of the Niagara Peninsula. After she heard this, she walked 20 miles through the night over about 17 hours to alert the British that the US were planning on taking Beaver Dams, and ultimately the British were able to repel the US attack, kind of defining the border in that area. So after the War of 1812, there was a little bit of unease in Canada. In 1837, there were two independent revolutions that were fought for similar yet different reasons, one by William Lyon Mackenzie and the other by Robert Nelson. Unlike the US revolutions, they weren't looking for republicanism. They didn't want to completely remove themselves from the British crown. They just wanted more self-rule and more representation back in the UK. Ultimately, this resulted in two things. First, the burning of Parliament in Montreal, which you can see behind us. And that was kind of like a symbol of the revolutions. But it also resulted in the UK recognizing all of the different provinces as one united Canada. It also kind of sparked off a period of high immigration to Canada. Between the War of 1812 and 1840, 800,000 people immigrated to Canada from the UK. So that's really when we start to see the population rising from in that respect. So we can't forget about the Pacific. This was going on as well. Between 1774 and 1775, the Spanish discovered the Strait of Juan de Fuca and kind of the area around Seattle, Vancouver, and Victoria. Ultimately, the Spanish did peacefully give that territory over to the British, and they established a lot of relations and trade with the First Nations. Fort Victoria and the colony of Vancouver were established in 1849, and ultimately, 9 years later, this would become a province of Canada. So next, in 1867, is the Confederation, when Canada wrote its constitution. This happened on the 1st of July, 1867. Here's their version of their congressional meeting. Like, we have our famous, this is their equivalent. Ultimately, Canada wrote their own constitution and became a semi-independent state because first, the British Crown viewed that Canada needed to ultimately defend itself, get its own military, get its own police force, and become less reliant on the Crown. Also, this time, the Pacific Railway, Canada's link from the Maritimes all the way out to British Columbia, was established, and the UK felt that Canada needed to control that itself. Also, Quebec saw it as an opportunity for the French population of Canada to get more representation and more control over their own destiny than they did as part of the British Empire. And ultimately, there were fears that the US would encroach on Canada if they didn't form them as some sort of legal unified state. Kind of interesting facts, Newfoundland voted not to join. Newfoundland didn't want to join the Confederation for a myriad of reasons. Ultimately, they would remain a part of the UK until 1849. Not to skip ahead, but ultimately what happened was Newfoundland's economy was absolutely terrible. It was the poorest province in North America by, or at least in Canada by a long shot. At one point, they declared independence from the UK, then attempted to redeclare dependence on the UK. And ultimately, it resulted in the UK telling Newfoundland, hey, either join Canada or just come back to us full time. And they ultimately voted to join Canada. The man kind of behind the bubble here was Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald. who's become kind of an interesting figure in modern Canadian history due to his mistreatment of First Nations people. So speaking of that, there was some trouble out west. So after Confederation, Canada actually ended up getting a lot more British and centrally controlled, which was a problem for both the Catholics and First Nations people. Essentially, they had moved out to Manitoba and Saskatchewan, kind of over by the Great Plains, in order to live their own lifestyle. They created a culture called the Métis, which was a blend of the two cultures. And ultimately, in 1868, 1869, the federal government of Canada said, all right, that's it. Like, no more Catholic public schools, like that you know, we can't do that anymore. And a man named Louis Riel led the revolution, and actually the first couple battles between his rebellious forces and local militias were won by the rebellious forces in a landslide. Ultimately, his cause would fail, and the couple major things would come out of these conflicts. So first, it really demonstrated to the federal Canadian government that A, there needed to be a strong national police, which we know is the RCMP, the Mounties, and it also showed the need for a purely independent Canadian military. Also in between the two revolutions, it marked 1876, which was the Indian Act, which kind of dictated how Canadian First Nations relations would go. It established reservations, they're very similar to how they are in the US, their legal standing, but it also established residential schools, which were essentially schools where Native Americans would be taken off the reservations to become civilized. And ultimately, these schools would actually last in Canada until the 1980s, which I found a little shocking when I came up here, that it was something that was only done away with so recently, but kind of interesting. So during this period, and even to this day, there was friction at the US-Canada border. So in 1846, the Oregon Treaty established the border between Canada and the US west of the Rockies at the 49th parallel, which leaves one of the places I really want to go to, but I haven't been yet, which is Point Roberts. So Point Roberts, if you look at the city of Vancouver, if you drive straight south of the major city, there's a little peninsula which lies south of the 49th parallel. It's not connected to the US. There's no ferry service that goes between it and Washington, but it is US territory. So ultimately, it's about a 15 to 20 square mile area with about 3,000 people living in it just south of Vancouver. It doesn't have its own schools, no hospitals, but it is US territory. As you can see behind us too, there's a lot of problems with the Alaska and Canadian border. When this was the biggest problem was after gold was discovered in the Yukon Territory. Canada wanted a seaport in what is now Alaska so that they could export it, but ultimately the UK just ceded all the land over to the US. There's still active border disputes between Canada and the US that I'm not going to get into, but if you just do a cursory like Wikipedia search, you can read up on those. So Canada's first kind of big national moment was the First World War. It really solidified Canada's place not only as a independent nation, but also as a major international player. Ultimately, out of a population of just a couple million, 600,000 Canadians would enlist, and almost 40% of all people that were mobilized became casualties. There were 67,000 people killed, 137,000 people wounded. Some major contributions done by Canadians in the First World War. So first, it was known as Canada's 100 Days. This included the Battle of the Somme, Vimy Ridge, and Passchendaele. The picture behind us is the Canadian Memorial at Vimy Ridge, which is on the back of Canadian $5 bills now. Also, the poem, I'm sure we all read it in high school, On Flanders Fields, was written by a Canadian soldier during the First World War. And now, Robert, thank you for your patience, my favorite moment in Canadian history. So Canada's head of state is the monarch, who is represented in Canada by the governor. So ultimately, the crown and by proxy, the governor holds the right to veto any law, act, motion proposed by Parliament. So in 1926, Canada held an election for their federal government. At the end of the election, no clear one party had a majority, and they had to conform a confederation of different parties to establish a government. So ultimately, this process didn't go as seamlessly as it normally did. Different parties switched sides on issues. Ultimately, key people within the parties were replaced with others, and it basically the confederation, the government at the end, almost wasn't the government that was originally voted for. So in 1926, the prime minister who ended up winning the election went to the governor, that's him, Governor Byng, and said, hey, like, this is a completely messy process, like, this hasn't done well, please, declare a no faith, like, in the government, let us re-elect. And ultimately, the Canadian governor said no. He wouldn't permit them to hold another election. And this ultimately resulted in about a 4 to 5 month period where there was no functioning government in Canada because the governor used the veto power. Ultimately, they would form a confederation and move forward with the government, but it set a precedence in Canada that the governor and the crown wouldn't interfere with Canadian politics, and it was a major step in kind of divorcing themselves from UK's parliament. Thanks, Robert. Does that answer the question you asked earlier?
It does, and it wasn't quite what I was expecting, because as I said, when I lived in Australia, one of the history things they taught us was like back in the 50s or 60s or sometime, they did exactly that, but they actually threw out Parliament and had a new election.
Wow.
So, yeah.
I guess you don't always learn from your mistakes, So, the Depression hit Canada just like the U.S. Like the U.S., at first they attempted to do nothing, and that was followed by basically a copy-paste of FDR's New Deal in Canada. Ultimately, the Depression would end a trade war between Canada and the U.S. and would start drawing Canada closer to the U.S. The origins of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is the equivalent of the CBC, and Air Canada were established during this time. Also kind of an interesting fact that is very kind of antithesis to the US, the Bank of Canada, which is their equivalent of the Fed, actually went from being a private entity to a government-controlled entity, which it still remains to this day. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster was passed, which basically divorced the British Crown from Canada, with the exception of being able to amend Canada's constitution. So World War II, Canada participated. They symbolically waited 1 week after the UK declared war to declare war themselves, kind of showing that, hey, we're an independent country, not just following along with the crown. Ultimately, 1.1 million out of 11.5 million Canadians would serve in World War II. Just some highlights for US-Canada relations during World War II. So OSS agents, which would later go on to be the CIA, most of them were trained in Ontario, just outside Ottawa. The US actually occupied the Yukon Territory after Pearl Harbor. Their goal was to build a highway that went up to Alaska so they weren't dependent on sea lanes. The Canadian government also participated in the internment of Japanese citizens, just like the US did. And ultimately, it did bring Canada and the US significantly closer together and started to pull it away from the UK. Post-World War II, as I previously talked about, Newfoundland finally decided to join Canada in 1949. They were also a founding member of NATO, and the establishment of universal healthcare came in the 1950s. Canada really showed itself on the international stage when, after the Suez Crisis, Canada's Secretary of External Affairs went on to manage the crisis and would win a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. And in 1958, Canada and the US established NORAD, the defense, basically an organization whose primary goal is to defend the North American continent. So that handsome devil, you might not guess, but he is related to Canada's current handsome devil prime minister. That is Pierre Trudeau, who is probably one of the largest political figures in Canadian history. He was the prime minister on and off again between the 1960s through 1980s. And he's honestly has had a profound impact on kind of the liberalization of Canada. So one of the first big things that happened in Canada during this period was Quebec's push for independence. This was first attempted through even terrorist means. There were hostages that were taken, bombings that were done throughout Canada and in the province of Quebec. And in 1980, Quebec had a referendum where they ultimately voted to remain a part of Canada, but it only passed by about a 5 to 6% margin. So it was a very contested vote. During this period, we also see the adoption of the maple leaf flag that we all know is Canada's flag today in 1965. But ultimately, Pierre Trudeau's legacy was first bilingual requirements. So everything that the federal government of Canada puts out has to be in both French and English. If you want to be above a certain rank in the Canadian government, Canadian military, whatever, you have to be bilingual to a certain threshold. He also resulted in the mass liberalization of Canada. So along with that came relaxed immigration policies, which did bring on a wave of immigrants. And he also promoted, even at this time, getting away from oil and looking towards greener alternatives, which ultimately resulted in the alienation of the Western provinces that rely on mineral extraction, oil extraction in order to keep their economy afloat. And that alienation of Western provinces remains to this day. For example, Justin Trudeau's cabinet doesn't have anyone from Alberta or Saskatchewan. I think he has one person from Manitoba out of a parliament of about, or out of a chamber of about 30 cabinet members. So it definitely is still pervasive to this day. So this is the final kind of piece I'm going to talk about Canadian history. I don't want to get too much into modern history, but on 29th of March 1982, the UK officially passed a law preventing them from being able to alter Canada's constitution. As far as I'm concerned, Canada finally got its independence. During this time, we also saw Canada and the US become highly intertwined with each other. Things like NAFTA and other trade acts were passed that allowed easier flow of goods between the two. And picture behind us is kind of an interesting moment called the Oka crisis. So essentially what happened was some developers wanted to build a golf course that fell on First Nations land. They consulted with some members of the tribe, but not all the leaders and elders, and it sparked a lot of unrest within the territory. Ultimately, some members of the First Nations killed an RCMP officer and barricaded the entrances to the reserve to stop people from coming in and doing the development. Ultimately, Quebec had to call on the National Army to defuse the situation. And ultimately, the situation would be diffused and the golf course would ultimately be built. But this is something in Canada's recent history that kind of colors all dealings with First Nations people. I'm not sure if you guys covered the news. It was big up here in Canada, but the Wet'suwet'en protest regarding a pipeline that was going to be built through First Nations lands. Canada's government wants to avoid another situation like this, where you have First Nations people squaring off with army, with military members. And also, fun fact, the guy on the left would go on to act in numerous adult films after his time in the Canadian Armed Forces. So now onto the Canadian government. We kind of touched on it, but it is a constitutional monarchy. The Queen is the head of state, who's represented by a governor. The upper house is the Senate with 105 members, and the lower house is Parliament with 388. Their Senate's a little different than ours. The governor appoints senators for life. They're usually well-known Canadians or former members of Parliament, but the Senate's view is to more take a review of legislation from a non-partisan standpoint, and they'll often do inquiries or investigations into basically things it sees might be a problem within Canada's government. There's also a Supreme Court, which acts very similar to ours. And as we touched on earlier, Canada's legal system uses common law, with the exception of Quebec, which basically, as long as it's internal to Quebec, they can continue to use civil law. Kind of like Louisiana. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Leo. Correct me if I'm wrong, Louisiana still uses a civil law system?
Yeah, they do. Sorry, yeah, they do.
No, you're good. I just want to make sure I got that right. So the governor of Canada is usually it's appointed for an indeterminate amount of time, usually up to 8 years. And another interesting thing, until Pierre Trudeau in the 80s, Canada didn't have an explicit Bill of Rights. All of Canada's rights were considered to be implied. So basically, it was up to courts to determine if something was or was not a right of a Canadian citizen. In the 80s, it was kind of a symbolic gesture, but there was a Bill of Rights passed. But I mean, that's recent history. That's only 40 years ago out of, we'll call it nominally 140-year history. Provincial governments, think of it as your state government, and they're set up in the same way as the federal government. There's a lieutenant governor and a premier who's the head of whatever province's state parliament. The lieutenant governor is also appointed by the Queen/governor, and they serve the same thing at a provincial level. So just to show you the differences between the provincial and federal government, it's honestly a lot like the U.S. division of powers. One of the interesting things I found when I moved here, while healthcare is federally mandated, it is up to the province to provide and determine what the scope of that healthcare is. There are minimum requirements, but every province has its own, and even sometimes multiple healthcare providers. So if you were to move from, say, Ontario to British Columbia, while you still have universal healthcare, you have to change your provider over from one to the other. Otherwise, basically, there's a lot of paperwork trouble while you sort out who pays for what, province to province.
I have a quick question about that.
Yeah.
Do the provinces get money like distributed per person, or is it like each province sets their own taxes for healthcare then?
So yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, part of the provincial taxes do go towards healthcare, but as part of the federal mandate, they do provide money as well.
Okay,
Where
that's what I figured.
Yeah, but that being said, part of that alienation of the Western provinces, when you look at a province like Alberta, it doesn't have any taxes outside federal taxes. All of their healthcare is being paid for by the taxes taken from other provinces. So that creates a lot of friction with basically the rest of Canada saying, hey, we're basically propping up the province of Alberta because they don't pay taxes, to which Alberta fires back and says, hey, we're the ones who have all the oil, who generate a lot of wealth for the country. So it's kind of a tit for tat, province to province within the system. There's also municipal government, but to be honest, it's the same as any city government we have in the States, mayors and city councils and stuff like that. So I don't want to get into it too much. Just an outline of Canada's court system too. It's very similar to the US, the way it's practiced and the way their hierarchy of federal courts go. So I just wanted to let you guys know, this is one of my personal anecdotes or personal observations from my time in Canada. Just a political spectrum of the different parties. Sorry if there are any libertarians out there. I just included the two, we'll call it major US parties. So you look at the Democrats and the Republicans, one's a little left of center, one's a little right of center, but ultimately they're still pretty centrist parties. If you look at Canadian politics, at least from a US perspective, everything is significantly left of center. The Conservative Party of Canada, honestly, I'd say is pretty analogous to the Democrats. They're a fairly centrist left party. And the Liberal Party of Canada, if I could overlap the two and still have you guys be able to read this graph, I probably would have. To be honest with you, I don't see any real difference between the Liberal and Conservative Party. I think they're both fairly socially liberal. I think the only difference is when it comes to some economic and monetary policies, the Liberal Party of Canada is a little bit more left than the Conservative Party.
And Trudeau is liberal, right?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Trudeau is liberal?
Yes, yeah, Trudeau is the Liberal Party, and they're the party that's in charge now. Up until Trudeau won, his first term was probably 6 years ago, Canada had been ruled by the Conservative Party for the first time in a long time, and their reign lasted for about 12 years. So a lot of Obama's time up until the end, and a lot of George Bush's time was Conservative Party of Canada, vice Liberal. Further on the spectrum, you have the New Democratic Party, which is a fairly left-wing socialist party. Then you have the Green Party, which I put there just because honestly they're not too different from a U.S. Green Party. Kind of off the spectrum, just because I'm not sure where to put them, is Bloc Québécois. I know that they are socialist, but their big thing is Quebec first. Everything for Quebec. So I'm not sure how that would fall in a spectrum of typical U.S. parties. So they do exist. They do have some following, but I'm not exactly sure where they fit in on the spectrum. So kind of getting to that previous slide, Canadian culture does influence their government a lot. They are a much more liberal society than the U.S. is. Extremely pro-immigrants, pro-LGBT rights. Marijuana is legalized nationwide. Even members of their military can smoke it, which caught me off guard when I first came up here. Healthcare is a huge thing, and essentially there are no guns in Canada. I didn't want to delve into this too much. I didn't do too much research. There is a way to get guns in Canada, depending on what province you're in. There are different legal wickets you need to jump over, but essentially most of it involves registering with the government to get a license, taking safety classes, and some provinces or areas, I think, I'm not 100% sure on this, require you to store it in like essentially a police lockup instead of like in your house. Another kind of anecdote, I don't have any facts to base this up besides just things I've noticed, but common law marriage is significantly more common in Canada than it is the US. Basically, marriage isn't seen as something that has to be done in the courts, and common law marriages have a lot more legal rights in Canada than they do in the US. Another thing too, all parties pretty much are strong social safety nets. Even the Conservative Party would not want to do away with something like employment insurance or universal health care, things of that nature. So now on to Canada's economy. They're the 10th largest in the world at 1.7 trillion US dollars. They have the third highest petroleum reserves in the world and the third highest natural resources in the world. A lot of that's in lumber and minerals. The fourth largest exporter of natural gas, but they do run a trade deficit of 25 billion Canadian dollars. Kind of an interesting thing too, their debt to GDP ratio is only at 40.9%. For example, the US's is at 104%. Canada having a balanced budget is actually a huge voting issue up here. Canada's government is very sensitive about running in the red, and that is unlike the US where it's almost, I wouldn't say apathetic because it's definitely some people's big issue. Up here, it's largely everyone's issue. Just to show you how closely intertwined the US and Canada economy is, 75% of all Canada's exports go to the US, and 51% of all of Canada's imports come from the US. Some key industries, real estate is the largest in Canada. Manufacturing comes next, with natural resource extraction after that, and finally finance. As previously mentioned, they are part of NAFTA, and their currency, it's worth anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 of a US dollar, kind of depending on the day. Like I said, there's no pennies, and all of their paper money is plastic, and they come in different colors depending on the amount of the money the paper bill is worth. Their inflation rate sits just above 2%. For example, over the last 10 years, the US has sat just below 2%, so it's slightly higher, but honestly not significant. And unlike, as previously mentioned, unlike the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Canada is controlled by essentially their Secretary of Commerce. So Canada's culture, when it comes to sports, obviously hockey is king. The CFL does exist. I don't know how familiar you guys are with it. There are some different rules than the NFL, but ultimately nobody but kind of old grizzly Canadians watch the CFL. The NFL is definitely bigger up here. Curling is on TV. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's absolutely a blast to watch. And if you get the opportunity at the next Winter Olympics, highly recommend checking out some curling. The Toronto Raptors and Blue Jays are huge everywhere throughout the country. They're kind of like the national teams. especially with the Raptors winning the NBA Finals, a couple, 2-3 years ago. Everyone is a Toronto Raptors fan. When it comes to movies and TV, it's pretty much the same as the States. I guess some of the differences: CBC, Canada's PBS equivalent, has a mandate to represent primarily Canada. So almost all the actors are Canadian, set in Canada, and they have to provide equal French and English programming. Obviously, some big Canadian shows that are in the U.S. now: Letterkenny, Trailer Park Boys, and Schitt's Creek. So when it comes to Nickelback, no Canadian, again, this is my personal observation and opinion, I have no evidence to back this up. The whole country loves Nickelback. They won't honestly admit it, and if you make fun of it, basically they'll be like, oh yeah, haha, Nickelback sucks, and then maybe 5 minutes later they'll respond with, actually, I did go to like a couple of Nickelback shows and they were pretty great. So it's a secret love that they're all kind of embarrassed to admit. I think the thing I'm the most flummoxed with Canadian culture with, just because I have no parallel to it, is this band called the Tragically Hip. They're a Canadian indie pop rock band that essentially their lead singer was diagnosed with brain cancer, and the band decided, hey, we're going to do one last farewell tour where they toured all of Canada. And I do not know a single Canadian over the age of probably 22 who did not either go to or watch their final tour on TV. It is incredible, the love this band receives.
Nathan and Leo, the writer of MGO Blog, is a very large Tragically Hip fan. MGO Blog Brian.
I'm honestly surprised you'd heard of the band. I'd never heard of them before I came up here. Yeah, they have a cult following for sure.
Yeah, I think there are people in the Midwest of the U.S. who like them. I certainly hadn't heard of them before. I heard them on the radio here, but
we're also talking about from a Michigan perspective, which is about as close to Canada as you get in the United States.
Yeah, that's fair. Fair. Yeah, very fair. When it comes to Canadian cuisine, obviously poutine, gravy and cheese curds on French fries. They have different flavors of chips. The big one up here is ketchup chips, but they also have allspice chips, which are covered in, think of every different type of potato chip you can think of and put them all in one potato chip. I've tried them. They're actually not bad. I've not had a ketchup chip though. The biggest thing, and this one I did research because I knew it was a stereotype, but I wanted to have statistics. Kraft dinner, what we know as just Kraft mac and cheese, is huge. On average, the average Canadian eats 3.2 boxes of Kraft dinner a week. So just a cultural force.
That can't be true.
Say again?
That can't be true. That is insanely high.
So I actually had to go do my research on this one. And like, just for example, I guess this is a good time to, for example, like the pasta section, or as they would say, pasta section, I'd say that aisle is probably half Kraft dinner.
Huh.
It's incredible. Like there's no equivalent. I guess obviously like maple syrup is huge up here. There's especially in like Quebec, it's a major economic power. Canada actually has strategic maple syrup reserves that they can release basically if there's a shortage, and that way they can control the price. Tim Hortons, I don't know if you guys have heard of Timmy's. It's Canadian Dunkin' Donuts, but it's owned by Burger King, which many Canadians are very upset about. I have people that swear that the quality of Tim Hortons has gone down significantly since Burger King bought it. And ultimately, there's no such thing as Canadian bacon. Like it's purely a U.S. invention. No Canadian I've talked to has ever heard of it. You can't get it on pizza. It's purely U.S. thing. Canada's population too is extremely diverse, especially in younger generations. A lot of the pro-immigrant policies have resulted in a large, basically first-generation population in Canada. And ultimately, there's a lot of influences from that. Ultimately, the Canadian government in 2013 did a federal survey asking Canadians what Canadian values are. The top result, 92%, said that respect for the law was the top Canadian value. followed by 91% said that gender equality was a key Canadian value. And ultimately, a majority did say that universal health care was included as a Canadian value. So my observations on Canadian versus US culture, James Franco said it best in the interview, same, but different. Again, to stress that these are my views, not the views of the Canadian government or the US government, US Navy, Department of Defense, et cetera. From the US perspective, I like to think of the US-Canadian relationship as similar to the Australian-New Zealand relationship. Essentially, both of them are similar to a point culturally, especially in their origins, but one of the two has become the more dominant in culture and economy and international influence. And to a degree, it's created a slight Napoleon complex where Canadians are very quick to point out the differences between the US and Canada and to assert that no, we're not American, we are our own independent nation with our own culture. This has also resulted in a culture that I found to be surprisingly patriotic. Before I came up here, I was always told that, oh, you know, how do you know what country you're in? You just look out your window and you see all the American flags flying all over the place. But I've found that there is just as much basically Canadian flags, Canadian t-shirts, Canadian bumper stickers, you know, with their flag as there is in the States, which I found very surprising. There's not one Canadian accent. Like, I think this is, I would be fairly obvious, but you know, the stereotypical Canadian accent we all think of, really I've only heard from people from Ontario. Really, basically province to province, there's a different speech pattern, a different accent as you move through the country. And I'd say the stereotype being Canadians are friendly and polite has held up. I'd say that all in all, like people are very easy to talk to. They come up to you and just check. You know, I'm clearly not from here. They make sure I'm not lost, like make sure I'm doing okay, stuff like that. Very, very welcoming. I think the most interesting Canadian cultural thing that I've found is that they are militant about taking your shoes off in the house. I don't know what kind of households you guys were raised in. We were definitely a household shoes off in the household kind of thing. But you like if I'm carrying groceries, like if I need to like run to the kitchen because I'm carrying all my bags in one trip, like I'll leave my shoes on. Like if I'm gonna come in, just like sit down on the couch and take my shoes off there, like I'll do that. I was yelled at when I went to people's houses for not taking my shoes off the moment I went in the door. I went to a holiday party at one of my boss's house where the whole party was shoes off. And ultimately, I saw the intelligence in this because somebody spilled beer in the center of the kitchen, and we all basically just mopped it up with our socks for the next 2 hours. So I've never seen anything like it. I've talked to people from Australia, I've talked to people from New Zealand, and truly Canada is the only place I've seen with this kind of militant culture. More of my observations, everything's spelled differently. So unlike the US, they throw in U's where there don't need to be. Z is Z. And H, if you're saying like HQ, it'll be pronounced with a harder, like a HQ, like more of a throat sound. Tobacco is crazy expensive. I don't know if you guys smoke or dip, but a pack of cigarettes is about $15 and a tin of dip is about 30. So it's significantly more expensive up here. There's significantly less diversity in supermarkets. Like, for example, when I go back to the States, all my coworkers ask me to pick up like different types of Captain Crunch and different types of Pop-Tarts. Like the only 3 Pop-Tart flavors I've seen up here are blueberry, strawberry, and cinnamon sugar. Like just throughout the supermarket, it's a significant change in the amount of diversity of products, I think would be the best way to put it. I think this is more of a British Columbia thing than Canada thing. But I have been publicly shamed for not recycling and for not using reusable bags at the supermarket. Another thing in Canada, college doesn't seem to be as necessary for people to get ahead in Canadian society. It's not ultimately, oh, you graduate high school and now you go to college. A lot of people do community colleges to get associate's degrees and move on from there. There aren't as many people that seem to just go straight into college. They'll usually take like leap years or gap years and kind of mess around that way at a higher rate than I saw in the States. But even the people that do go to college, the percentage of people that go to out-of-state schools is significantly lower. A lot of even the major universities like McGill and McMaster University will end up commuting. They'll end up staying at home and just commuting to school instead of going to dorms. And then ultimately, like, there isn't as much diversity within provinces when it comes to local cultures and dialects. Like, I'm sure, Pat, you're from Texas. I've never been to Michigan, but I'm sure it's just as bad, it's just as diverse. And like New York, I mean, you could go 50 miles and it'd be a significantly different accent. I mean, hell, you move between the different boroughs of New York and you're dealing with different accents and cultures. Within Canada, like within one province, like British Columbia, Ontario, you might get a couple, but it's nowhere near on the scale of US diversity for accents and local cultures. And honestly, that's an ultimate reflection, I think, on just the population of the country. I mean, 37 million people, that's a significant less amount of people to have that kind of local diversity. But all in all, I found Canada to be a very friendly, welcoming, and genuine country, both the people and the population. And I would highly recommend a visit to your foreign neighbors when you guys get the chance. I apologize for running a little bit over my time, but does anyone have, any questions?
I have a question. You said that their Senate is appointed by the governor.
Yes.
Is the governor still appointed by the British Crown or the UK in some respect?
Yes.
So is there any like controversy about the Senate being kind of indirectly chosen by the UK?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I never thought about it that way before. I guess the Senate doesn't have as many teeth as the U.S. Senate does. Essentially, they're more of a symbolic body, to be honest with you. Like a lot of people that end up being senators are basically they're famous Canadians. Either they're well known within their city, like big businessmen, or they had already served in the House of Commons. And it's almost a symbolic movement to say like, hey, thank you for your service. Like you are now part of the Senate. So I never thought about it that way before, essentially saying that the UK still does control who gets to go to the Senate. But at the same time, I think part of it's just because I don't think people don't take issue with it because it's almost just a symbolic gesture to a degree. Like there are very few bills that originate, if any, that originate in the Senate. It's almost just a perfunctory check in the box.
I have a question. Isn't there some, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like I remember reading something about how Canadian radio can only play Canadian music, or like they have to play a certain percentage of Canadian music. Is that true?
Yep. So that's under the same thing as the CBC mandate. So if you are listening to a state-funded radio station or watching state-funded television, that's where the mandate kicks in. I think it's either 75 or 80% of all the music or television or movies have to be primarily like basically Canadian artists or have to be Canadian actors, Canadian production teams, stuff like that. So like if you're just going to turn on like 101.9 country FM, like you'll still get like your Luke Bryant's and your Florida Georgia Line and shit like that. But when you turn over to the state-owned is when that kicks in.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
After your time in Canada, would you consider, I guess, like leaving the United States permanently and living there, or no, or too soon to tell?
Probably no. I think ultimately, like, I'm happy to get this experience to basically live in another culture, even though it might just seem like it's right next door. But ultimately, like, it is different from the U.S. and not sound too mushy and flag wavy. Like I do miss the States. I do miss even the small differences are a difference. Like I'm happy I came up here and got to experience something I never would have otherwise, but ultimately I think I will end up back in the States.
Have you ever watched Dirty Money on Netflix? And if so, have you seen the episode about the $20 million heist from the Strategic Maple Syrup Reserve?
I did see that one. Yeah, that was again elected not to put it in, but I think it's a little Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. You know, the fact that there literally is like a strategic maple syrup reserve. Like, it's incredible. But I mean, hey, there's OPEC and stuff like that. You know, like there's different cartels that control reserves of other things. Why not maple syrup?
So you talked a little bit about NAFTA, and if I recall correctly, like I don't know if repealed is the right word, but Trump had this big push to like restructure NAFTA and like make it a better deal for the U.S. Has there been any comments just from people that you've talked to about that deal, or is it just in the back of people's minds?
So I don't want to go on the record talking about anything essentially political. As far as NAFTA goes, it's nothing that's mentioned day to day. Like it's definitely something that I think is present, especially with COVID-19. Like that has been the focus of most of Canadian legislating at this point. But yeah, it's not something that dwells. But that being said, as far as like the U.S. Canada trade being easy, I don't know a single Canadian I work with who doesn't have either family that permanently lives on the U.S. side or lives in the Detroit or Buffalo area that relies on being able to cross the border easily to go to their jobs in the States. So it's something I think, to answer your question, apolitically, I think it's something that's probably in everybody's minds, at least at the back of it, just because to have a breakdown in the ease of work and goods passing back and forth, like that would be detrimental to a lot of people.
I also wanted to ask the Michiganders if the shoes off in the house was a big thing up in Michigan.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like my house was very much similar to what you're describing, where it is the instant you cross the threshold of the door, it's shoes off. I think that's so I'm from a predominantly Dutch area though, and I think that's a Dutch thing.
Huh.
It has.
Yeah, I think it honestly correlates with the Canadian value of we all obey the law. Because I've been to plenty of houses in Michigan that were not shoes off houses, but it is definitely a common thing.
The theory that a Canadian gave me was essentially it's always so snowy, like significant parts of the year. You want to take your boots off right away so you don't track snow and like slush through the house.
Yeah,
which again,
Nathan's house had a mud room specifically, like that's what it's called.
Yeah, which I mean, purely, I mean, the Dutch theory, like that might be just obeying the law, like it all might be just as valid. Like it's just hypothesizing, but I don't know. I thought it was interesting. All right. Well, if there are no further questions, thank you all for coming to my TED Talk. Hope you learned something about Canada today.
Good talk.